Hey, what's going on everyone? On this video, I'm going to show you how to code the tail program using Python. This is a very common coding challenge or interview coding challenge, especially for network engineers. So hopefully this is going to help you solve the same problem or a similar problem during your interview. Alright, so let's go ahead and have a quick look here at the problem description, starting with the requirements. So the first requirement says that if only a file is passed to the program should behave the same as the tail program on Linux. The second requirement says that the user should be able to explicitly state the number of lines that the user wants the program to output to the console. And we're gonna get to understand that more in depth here because I'd like to have a quick look at the basic functionality of the tail program on the command line. Now we have a constraint here which states that the program is going to be used on a system with very limited amount of memory. So that's actually a red flag that we need to take into consideration here when we come up with our solution, because this is pretty much a space complexity that the interviewer is adding to the problem that we need to resolve. Alright, so before we get to coding, let's go ahead and have a quick look at the basic operation of the tail program on the Linux command line. Okay, so let's go ahead and try the tail program by just passing a file to it and see what happens. As we can see here on the screen, we got the last 10 lines of the file that we passed to the tail program, which in this case is the messages file. So that is actually the basic operation of the tail program when you don't explicitly pass a number of lines that you want the program to print out or to output to the console. So now let's go ahead and explicitly pass the number of lines that we want the tail program to print or to output to the console. So let me go ahead and clear the screen here. Okay, so we are going to use the option -n followed by a digit or an integer number. For the sake of brevity here, I'm going to pass the number 2. Okay, so just like you see here on the screen, we got a different behavior when we pass the number 2 with the -n option. And basically, the tail program just output the last 2 lines of the file messages that we passed to it. So that's kind of like the operation, or I'll say the requirements that we need to follow. So we need to take into account that when the user doesn't pass any extra arguments aside from the file, we need to follow the same behavior as the tail program on Linux. So now that we know the basis of how the tail program operates, let's go ahead and go back to the editor here and start coding our solution. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is to import the sys module. So let's go ahead and do that here. Alright, so that is the module that is going to allow us to receive the arguments that the user passed to the program and eventually perform any kind of action with them. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and create a function here for our program. We're going to name this function pytail, and that function is going to take an argument or arguments. Okay, so within the function, we need to define how we are going to handle those arguments and eventually be able to find and load the file that the user is going to pass to us or to the program. We're going to do that with a simple context manager here using the open built-in function, and within the open function we are going to pass 2 arguments. The first one is going to be the file name or the file location that the user is going to pass, and we're going to quickly do that by just getting the first argument that the user is going to pass to our program. So just keep in mind that the method that we are going to use from the sys module, which is called the RV, is going to place all of the arguments that the user passed to the program in a list. So that's why we are basically doing some kind of indexing here and just getting the first value from the list, which in this case, in the case of our program, is going to be the file that the user is going to pass. So the second argument that we are going to pass to the open function is the operation mode. In our case, we only need to read the file. So we are going to perform a basic create operation. So within this context manager, we are going to perform a flow control or if statement that is going to help us determine whether or not the user passed more than one argument to the program. And we can quickly do that with an if statement that uses the length function just to kind of know the length of the list. Okay, so let me explain what I just did here. I just used the built-in length function on the arguments variable just to kind of know whether or not the variable contained more than one argument within it. So with the length function, just keep in mind that it's going to give you a positive number on the result. It is not going to take into account the index position, just the amount of values that you have within the list in this case. So if it is more than one, because one, it will be pretty much the file that the user is going to pass. So if it is longer than one, then we are going to basically assume that the second value is going to be the amount of line that the user explicitly defined for the program to print out to the console. All right, so within the if statement here, if that condition is true, we are going to perform a basic operation here, which is to pass the X amount of line that the user explicitly defined. And we can do that with the following statement here. So let me kind of explain what I just did here. So I'm just basically using the relines method from the open function, and that's going to break up every single line into a separate item within a list. So the following section here, like from this point to this point, I am just performing some basic list indexing functionality here. So the minus here just means that you are going to be performing some reverse indexing operation here. So that's just the same as if you try to do a -1, which is going to give you always the last item of a list. But in this case, we are doing the minus and then the number that the user is going to pass as an extra argument. So we can basically alter the behavior of the output operation. In other words, just to output the X amount of lines that the user wants from X all the way to the end. So let me go ahead and quickly remove the space here that I just put just to explain this part here. So that is what's going to happen if that condition here is true. So if it is not true, meaning that the user only passed a single argument being the file, we are going to do the following. All right, so let me explain what I just did here, especially on the last part of this line. So here we are again performing some basic list indexing here. So in this case, we are defining or explicitly defining the default behavior of our program. And in this case, we are going to basically load the last 10 lines from the file onto this list type variable called lines. Okay, so next we are going to perform a for loop operation here for us to print the lines that we have on the lines variable. Okay, so this is a basic for loop in which we are iterating over the lines variable, which is pretty much the list that contains the lines that we loaded from the file onto the variable. All right, so the only thing that we have pending here is to basically call our function here and of course pass the arguments that the user is going to pass through the command line. And we can quickly do that here by just calling our function and passing the following arguments. And this is where we're gonna use the sys module here, and especially the RV method within that module. So let's keep in mind that the RV method from the sys module by default is going to give us all the arguments, including the file name that the user is going to execute, which in our case is the pytail.py, and then the other arguments such as the file name. So we are going to perform an indexing here on the RV method in order for us to skip the first argument of that list. And we can quickly do that by just doing the following: 1 and a column within square brackets, and that's going to give us all the arguments that the user passed to the program, starting from the value that is on index number 1 all the way to the end. So this is pretty much all we need to do here. So let's go ahead and go back to the console and test our code. All right, so back at the console, let me just first make sure that this is the right directory where the pytail.py is. And yes, that's the one. So let's go ahead and do the following. we're going to do the same test that we did with the tail program at the beginning of the video. So the first test that we're gonna do is by just passing a file to our program and see how it behaves. Okay, so it looks like we have an error here in our code. So it says here global name R. Okay, yeah, looks like we have a misspelling here of the word arguments. All right, so that's fixed. Let's go ahead and go back to the console. We're gonna clear the screen and we're gonna do the same test again. All right, so now we got what we expected. So by just passing the file to our program, we got the last 10 lines of the messages file. So let's go ahead and clear the screen real quick here and try another test by passing the number of lines that we want the program to print or to output to the console. Okay, so we are going to pass number 2 and see what happens. Alrighty, so now we have only 2 lines output to the console, which means this is working fine, and we can quickly confirm that this is the correct value that we're getting here by just doing the same test but using tail. Alright, so here we have it. We got the same result. Just look at the time of the logs here, and yep, it's the same exact line. So we successfully coded the tail program using Python here. Okay, so going back to the code here, let's go ahead and confirm that we indeed took into account the constraint that was added to the code here. Again, the constraint here states that the program that we just wrote here is going to be executed or used on a system with very limited amount of memory. So we needed to avoid loading the whole content of the file onto memory and instead just focus on the line by default that the program is going to be looking for, which is going to be the last 10 lines, or if the user passed the number of lines, just loading those amount of line onto memory. So taking a look at the context manager within the function, it might seem to you that we are loading the content of the file onto the file variable, but that's not the case. What we are doing here is just creating a file type object, but not reading the content of it or loading the content onto memory. In the only sections that we are actually loading content from the file onto a variable is within the conditional statement here. So in order for me to show you that that's actually what's happening here, let's go ahead and comment out these 2 lines here. Now we are going to use a method from within the sys module that we have already within our code space, and that method is going to be the sys.get size of, and we are going to pass the variable file. So that's going to give us the size in bytes of that variable, and then we are going to compare the size of it with the size of the lines variable once we are out of the conditional statement here. We're gonna do that by just doing the same thing that we did above, but instead we're gonna pass now the lines variable. So let's go ahead and run that code and see what happens. Okay, so we are back at the console here. So let's go ahead and do the same test that we did before and see what the outcome of it is. But just keep in mind that now we are not printing the actual content of the file. Instead, we are printing the size of the file variable and the lines variable whenever we match a condition, and then we're gonna compare those 2 sizes, and that's gonna help us know whether or not we are actually loading the content of the file when we open the context manager. Okay, so here we got the result. So the file variable when we open the context manager only has 144 bytes. In the case of the lines variable, which is the one that by default is going to load the last 10 lines of the file onto the variable, that one has 152 bytes. So let's go ahead and do another test here real quick. We are going to pass the number 50, and what that means is that we are basically asking the program to give us the last 50 lines of the file. Right, so again, we have the same size for the file variable, but if you look at the lines variable size, it is 472 bytes. So that basically confirmed that we are not loading the whole file when we open the context manager. In the only situations that we are loading content from the file is again within the conditional statement here. Alright, so that kind of wraps it up for now. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this kind of content so you don't miss any future videos. I'll see you in the next one.